Hello, my name is Deborah Fox, and I'm the Artistic Director of NYS Baroque in Ithaca and Syracuse, and Pegasus Early Music in Rochester, New York. I'm delighted that you're joining me today for our concert, Brahms from Oz. This pandemic of 2020-21 has been challenging for American arts organizations, to say the least. But one of the silver linings is that because we've moved to a virtual format, we can present musicians from all around the world, like today in concerts that have been recorded especially for us. Today I have the great musical and personal pleasure of introducing our concert and our artists. Cellist Daniel Yeadon and pianist Neal Peres da Costa have been friends of mine for more than 30 years. Neal and I met in London in the 1980s when we were in graduate school together, and we've remained friends ever since. Now they live in beautiful Sydney, Australia, where they have active performing careers with many ensembles, including Ironwood, whom many of you in upstate New York heard live several years ago. Their research into 19th century Romantic performance practice has been groundbreaking and has truly reshaped the way we hear this music. If you want to hear more after the concert, you can check out their new CD called Romantic Dreams, released with Ironwood. It's piano quintets by Louise Farrenc and Camille Saint-Saëns, and it's truly gorgeous. Neal is Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Historical Performance at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And Danny is lecturer there, where he teaches cello, viola da gamba, chamber music, and performance practice. The Sydney Conservatorium is a part of the University of Sydney. Now, just a little housekeeping before you meet Neal and Danny. Please feel free to enter your comments and questions in the YouTube chat box. They are here online with us and will respond to you. You can find a program link in the description area below your YouTube picture. We are thrilled to be able to offer all of our concerts online this season for free. But at the same time, we feel it is crucial to continue paying all of our artists their professional fees. So there's a little disconnect because we're not selling tickets. If you are so moved to make a donation to support our program, we are grateful for your support. There are links in the description box, and we will put them in the chat as well. Thank you so much for your support. It truly helps to keep the music coming. Great. So welcome, Neal and Danny.
Hi there.
Thanks, Deb.
So glad to have you with us today, all the way from Australia. Here in the Northeast, it's starting to be spring, and we're starting to think maybe we'll be able to play live concerts sometime in the near future. But tell us, how are things in Australia?
Oh, well, they're wonderful, actually. They're pretty much back to normal. I've just been doing some concerts with an ensemble here all over New South Wales. And so we can have audiences up to 75% capacity. And yeah, it just feels great to be back to live music making. Yeah.
And even at the we're just going into autumn here, actually, or fall as you call it there in America, and our students have just come back to the conservatorium. We've just had one full week, and what we've noticed is there are crowds at the conservatorium, and there are concerts starting to happen there. So like the public are coming in obviously distanced and very carefully, but so it's great to see life coming back to a sort of sense of normality.
I can't wait till that happens here. But in the meantime, we are really thrilled to have you playing this concert for us today. So let's just dive right into some questions here. So when we met in London many, many years ago, you and I, Neal, were learning to play 17th century continuo together. That's a far cry from Brahms. So how did you get from Baroque to Brahms?
That's a great question, Deb. I'm going to reverse it and say, how did I get from Brahms to Baroque? Because actually, as you probably remember, I started my life as a modern piano player. That's what I studied, when I was growing up from the age of 5. And it was only in my last few years, actually in my last few years of high school before going to university, that I heard a harpsichord. And it was the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, and I heard this on a LP, and I was absolutely taken by Bach's music and the sound of the harpsichord, and had no idea what this thing was. How did it work? And then, of course, on my first day at university at Sydney, doing a music degree, there was a harpsichord in the hall, and one of our lecturers made me sit down and play some Bach on it. And that's how the whole journey started. But before that, I was already playing Brahms and other romantic composers, Chopin and so on. But my university years brought me very into contact with performing practice and playing on earlier keyboards. And it absolutely ignited a passion for playing harpsichord and fortepiano and that sort of thing. And so then, when you met me, we were doing the postgraduate course, right, at the Guildhall School. And that's where, obviously, living in London and going to all those concerts, it all became part of life. And I thought, yeah, this is the direction to go in. But then during my time, like 10 years in the UK, I went back around to realizing that while we'd been studying 17th century continuo and all that sort of stuff, there was a lot to know also about the end of the 19th century or the 19th century in terms of how people played. And it was very different to what I had grown up with. So there was a fascinating opening back to Brahms.
Mm-hmm. So Danny, I imagine that you had a similar trajectory backwards and then forwards.
Indeed, yes. Romantic music was very much a part of my teens. I had a mother and stepfather who played a lot of Brahms's chamber music, and I joined in. So that really fueled my love of the whole language. And also I was really drawn to Brahms's piano music as a child, really quite early on, at the age of 7 or 8. So his Intermezzo used to make me cry and still do. So yeah, I had that strong affinity with Brahms's music at that age. And then when I went to study early music, the earlier repertoire, the Baroque and classical repertoire in my early 20s, I had a little bit of a break from Brahms. But I've worked my way through the repertoire, through the decades, well into the 19th century. And so, yeah, I'm really enjoying exploring the performance practices of the mid to late 19th century now.
It's such an interesting arc that we've been on, because when Neal and I were together in London, it was just about when Roger Norrington was just starting to talk about playing Mozart and period instruments, and that seemed like such a radical idea. And now you guys are doing Brahms and romantic music, and there's even been a recording of Stravinsky on period instruments, and so we're kind of reimagining musical performance as we go.
Indeed.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's very interesting with the Stravinsky and even Debussy now on period instruments. And of course, when we get to that bit, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we have a really amazing body of evidence in the earliest recordings ever made. So we get to compare how we've reimagined these, much later composers against some of the people who actually played that music in the first place. So it's a very interesting comparison to be able to make, and we learn a lot about what we've done and whether it really fits together or whether it doesn't fit together. And then that gives you a lot to think about music of the past.
Yeah,
it's been performed.
So different when you can hear actual players.
Yeah.
So then this leads me to the next question, which is what makes your concert today early music?
Aha.
Mm-hmm.
the main thing, I suppose, to remember is that any music from yesterday and before has a certain style of performance. It's just like when we have clothing fashion changing, one year flares are in, the next year they're not in, and another year, shorts are in and the next year they're not in. That's the same sort of way that fashion changed in all sorts of forms of culture. And in music, that happened over larger chunks of time, I suppose. So when we get back to Brahms, the style of performance that Brahms will have expected and have been used to is very different to how his music came to be played in the middle to later part of the 20th century. And the reason for that is that there was an amazingly strong shift in performance style in classical, what we call classical music now, in the first 20 to 30 years of the 20th century. There was a move towards what we call modern style, modernist aesthetics took over. And the biggest thing that changed is that there was much more a reliance on reading the score, the composer's score, and playing exactly what was in the score and not departing too much from it. But if we go back to Brahms, what research has told us and what the recordings from that time show us are that there was much more artistic freedom and license. Artists, the pianists, the cellists, the violinists, singers were all expected to put much more into the score to make it come to life. So, and they would use techniques and practices that were part of a language of that time, which changed dramatically in the 20th century. And so what we're doing in our performance is studying again those practices that those musicians used and using what we hear in the recordings of that time to give us a flavor of that language. And I suppose we're experimenting by putting that back into our playing. Some of it's quite foreign. I mean, it's kind of brand new for us in many ways. I mean, you know, we've been doing this for a little while now, so it's getting more into our blood. But sometimes the things that we challenge each other to do go against the grain, and that's why it's early music, because the same thing happens if we go back to the 17th century. You know, we might read something really interesting in a book which we're not used to hearing, and we say, well, let's try that out and see what happens. So that's why Brahms is early music.
Yes. Great. So speaking of improvisation, there is a piece on the program called an improvisation. Can you tell us about that and why and what it is?
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm going to take over again and speak.
That's
is that
fine.
all right?
It's fine.
So in the 19th and earlier centuries, one of the things that musicians did a lot of was improvisation. It was actually part and parcel of concerts. So it could take place, for example, by playing a prelude before a piece or before a work. Sometimes pianists would put in interludes between movements of, say, sonatas and things like that. And sometimes they would put a postlude on as well. And some of this music was kind of linking music. It would change the atmosphere from one part of, one style of music to another. And this type of performance is now becoming more popular. It's coming back. We didn't do it in the 20th century very much. And now musicians are starting to experiment again with this. Now, even though, as you know, we trained in playing continuo, much of which is improvisation, it's another whole thing to improvise a piece in the style of the late Romantic era. So I'm coming to grips with that. And in order to do that, I'm actually looking at pieces that were written out by other composers in the 19th century that are like improvisatory pieces. They have that sort of fantasy sort of style to them. And so what I've put in before the Brahms Intermezzo that you'll hear is a kind of improvisation type of piece. I'm playing it in an improvised sort of style, but it has been written down, and it's by J.B. Kramer, who was a very famous musician in the earlier part of the 19th century. And the piece is just a wonderful introduction to the particular Brahms Intermezzo. So I'm trying to recover that practice in our performance.
I think that's charming.
I just wanted to follow on from something Neal was saying about exploring performance practices of the 19th century or any era, really. It's interesting that in our journey with this, there was a stage where we took these things on board as mental constructs, really, and they felt a little bit self-conscious. But now that we've really explored them and experimented with them, they're now feeling really natural. And so it's wonderful to be at that stage where all of these performance practices come as second nature, really. So, you know, we're talking about tempo flexibility, arpeggiation, and dislocation of melody from the bass for Neal, and then portamento from me, and being a little bit more judicious with the use of vibrato, using a generally leaner style of vibrato from me.
I mean, it's really like a language, isn't it, that you just learn, and you have to really get it under your fingers and in your brain, and then it becomes second nature eventually.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
We know that Brahms was a pianist, and obviously he wrote these pieces for himself to play. But was he a cellist, and how is the Brahms sonata for a cellist to play?
As far as I know, Brahms wasn't a cellist. I think he was a viola player, like a lot of composers. But the fact that he played the viola, I'm sure, helped him understand how the cello works. And this E minor sonata is beautifully written. It just lies beautifully. There's nothing too technically challenging in the sense of, you know, really awkward fingerings and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's just a joy to play. And I have a sense that he'd really thought about the way to write for the instrument. Yeah. With the Schumann, which of course was originally written for clarinet and piano, it's a little more awkward to play, and I have a sense that Schumann didn't have quite the same affinity with string writing that Brahms had, even though he wrote some beautiful music, including the quartets and sonatas for string instrument and piano. They're generally a little more, they lie a little more awkwardly for the left hand. Yeah. So.
I could add in something about Brahms, and it's really to do with Brahms's, his compositional process, because of course he was one of these composers who fretted and fretted around his compositions, and he wrote the pieces obviously, and he sometimes had particular players in mind that he was writing for, string players. Joachim comes to mind, but also various other string players, and he would get them to play it, and then often even at the composition stage he would send the manuscripts off to several different string players to play and perform, and then he'd get comments back. And if you look at some of the correspondence, players would say, "Oh, that's terrible, don't write like that," or "This needs to change here because we can't play it." And so it wasn't until he'd gone through all those processes that finally it would go to the printers and be published. But
if you could just say a word about the venue that you used for this recording, because it's quite striking in the video.
Yes, the venue is the Verbruggen Hall at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, where we both work. And that's part of University of Sydney, of course. It was originally a stables block for the Government House, which is just down the road, quite close to the Opera House, and very, very near to the harbour. And then it was converted into a Conservatorium of Music in 1915. So it's over 100 years old now. But if you go down into the basement, you can actually still smell there's like a smell of horses down there, isn't it? It's amazing, and you'd never know with this beautiful surrounding. But it's been beautifully finished with all the wood, and it has a wonderful acoustic. And then of course the organ that you can see behind us in the background in our concert.
Well, it's a beautiful hall, and it's a perfect setting for your concert.
Cheers.
So thank you, Neal Peres da Costa and Danny Yeadon. And we are about to hear this very beautiful concert. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dave,
Thanks
for
very
having
much.
us.
For this concert, I'm playing on a replica of a piano that was made in 1868 by Johann Baptist Streicher. Streicher was a Viennese maker, and he was well known to Brahms and Clara Schumann, and Brahms particularly loved his pianos for various reasons. The instrument I'm playing is a straight-strung instrument, wooden framed, with 2 tension bars, and it's a Viennese action instrument. It has a Prell mechanic, which was very typical of Viennese actions from the time of Mozart right through to Brahms. The hammers are actually covered in leather rather than felt, and they make quite a punchy but sort of soulful voice-like sound. And this instrument has 2 pedals, a sustaining pedal and a shift pedal, which allows the strings to go from striking 3 strings to 2 strings. In most of the piano, in the bass end, it's 2 strings to 1 string, which gives the beautiful una corda effect. Brahms and the pianists who he influenced, many of them were Clara Schumann's students, used arpeggiation a great deal more than we expect to hear in piano playing today. Arpeggio playing was something that brought great expression to the music. It created texture. It was used to support melody notes to make them stand out of the texture. And it could be used also to energize chords. So if you played fast arpeggio, that would give the chord great energy. Throughout the 19th century, there's plenty of written evidence to support the use of arpeggiation, and we also hear it in the early recordings of the Brahms, Clara Schumann school pianists. Another technique that they used was manual asynchrony, the splitting of the hands so that a melody note was played generally after the bass note, sometimes before. Arpeggiation and asynchrony were hardly ever marked in the score, but it was expected that pianists would use this to create expression and artistic freedom. And the other really important practices that were part and parcel of 19th century performance were rhythmic alteration or freedom of rhythm, which means that in the high artistry and high artistic playing, musicians would place their notes differently to how they were notated in the score, as if they were speaking the notes, as if there were words that they were speaking. And they would also change the tempo quite freely according to the character of the movement, and again, to bring out and emphasize words and notes that were important in the text. And they had no compunction in staying in time or in a metronomic sort of sense. So we are bringing all of these practices to our performance in this concert.
For this concert, I'm using a cello by William Forster II. This instrument was made in 1781 in London. William Forster II was famous for making a cello for King George III with a beautiful inlay on its back. Mine has a beautiful back but doesn't have an inlay. I'm using gut strings, so pure gut A and D, and silver wound G and C with a gut core. So for this concert, Neal and I are exploring the performance practices of the 19th century, the German performance practices that we've read about in the treaties of the 19th century, and also that we hear on some of the very earliest recordings of the early 20th century of this kind of repertoire. So those performance practices that concern me particularly as a string player are, of course, vibrato and portamento. I'm exploring the use of less vibrato in general than we hear in modern performances. And with portamento, or the audible sliding between notes, I'm using a German-style portamento and making them more audible than we might hear in a lot of modern contexts.
you.